Hello, everyone, and welcome to another evening of live streaming review lessons for AP World History Modern. We've moved up to Unit 2 now, and we're talking about the Silk Roads, and we're talking about the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and we're talking about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. As a reminder, my name is Chad Smith. I'm an AP World History Modern teacher at MacArthur High School in Irving, Texas. Before we get into going about what we're going to learn today, let's take and to write 5 documents, and he gave you a prompt asking you to evaluate the extent to which 2 states religious view on merchants. So after you looked at that, those 5 documents, Christians and Muslims agreed that merchants were an essential part of the economy, and they agreed that merchants should be honest in their dealings, should not focus on just making a profit. Let's talk about 2 things real quickly. First of all, the prompt asked you to evaluate the extent the 2 religions differed in their view on Muslims. And this prompt and this thesis is only given similarities. Does that mean that this is an unacceptable thesis? No, because the extent that the 2 differed can be very little. And if it is in fact very little that the 2 are different, that must mean that there are similarities. So when you get a prompt and it asks you to evaluate the extent to which something was different or something was similar, it doesn't mean that you have to go with that type of a comparison. You can make the opposite type of comparison. Just be clear that you're making similarities or differences. I also want to point out words in this thesis that clearly demonstrate similarity. In this case, the word agreed is used more than once, and that word shares the common thread between Christians and Muslims. It's important to make sure that when you write a thesis, you have answers, but you also are it's important to make sure that when you write a thesis, you're using words from the prompt and you're providing direct answers, in this case, differences or similarities, and that those answers are clearly written, demonstrating comparison terms. You were also given the bonus opportunity to go down and turn this one thesis into 2 separate topic sentences, or to develop topic sentences. Topic sentences should look a lot like exactly what you put in your thesis, because you make the claims in your thesis, and then you take your topic sentences and you repeat those so you can flesh them out and demonstrate how the documents support those claims. So following that model, our topic sentences would look very much like they do in the thesis. Topic sentence number 1 says Christians and Muslims agreed that merchants were an essential part of the economy. And topic sentence number 2 says Christians and Muslims agreed that merchants should be honest and should not focus on just making a profit. Okay, we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about long distance trade routes in the period 1200 to 1450, but I don't want you to lose this information. Keep this information handy, because your homework today is going to be an opportunity to continue to work with documents. So keep this information handy. And remember, you probably didn't come up with the exact same thing that Mr. Logereau or I come up with. So please take the time to talk to your own AP World History Modern teacher and get feedback on the answers that you developed. All right. I've already previewed the lesson for you a little bit, but I want you to take some time and I want you to find common traits in the 2 different descriptions. Now, before I do that, it's going to be really hard to find common traits when you just read the first description. So what you're going to have to do in the first description is you're going to have to look for what characteristics, in this case, characteristics of the city being described. You're going to have to look for characteristics of the city. And then in the second document, you look for characteristics of the city. And then you compare your characteristics. Don't look for similarities in one document. You'll never, ever, ever find it. So let me give you about 90 seconds here. And in these 90 seconds, I want you to read the document and describe the characteristics of the city, which in this case is the city of Hangzhou, a famous Chinese city near the eastern coast. Okay, let's take a look at the second document. The second document is still describing a city, but this time, especially in the second paragraph, is describing the city of Samarkand. So again, I want you're spending time looking to compare the traits of the cities in the two different descriptions. So again, this time you're looking for characteristics, and you'll be following that up by doing a comparison. Okay, I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to look at your two lists of characteristics and try to find some similarities. Okay, let's take a look. So there's lots of possible answers here, but some that stood out to me was that there are goods in both, excuse me, there are goods in both that are being manufactured. In both cities, manufacturing has taken place. In the original document written by Marco Polo, a traveler, he said each guild, a guild of course is an organization of like like craftsmen or to try to create circumstances that best suit that industry. Each guild had 12,000 houses in the occupation of its workmen. That's a lot of people making things. The second document by de Clavio said silk and other crafts are all produced here in abundance. So in both documents, goods are being made in both cities. Another truth is that both cities that were described as being extraordinarily extravagant cities. Marco Polo described Hangzhou as a city beyond dispute, the finest and noblest in the world, meaning even more amazing than the cities back in Italy, where he's sending his actual work and his writing. De Clavio described Samarkand as the richness and abundance of this great capital and its district is indeed a wonder to behold. The final similarity is that in both places there were lots and lots of merchants and lots of trade happening. In Marco Polo's document, the number of wealth of the merchants and the amount of goods that passed through their hands were so enormous that no man could, for a just said, Turks, Arabs, Christians of all sects, Hindus all reside here. It's a reasonable inference that these people coming from all over the world are coming as merchants in order to sell their goods. And immediately he says the markets of Samarkand are filled with the merchandise imported from distant and foreign countries. So this is important reality about trade routes that we're going to talk about and review today. One of the most accomplishment and the growth of local economies and the reality that many merchants as a result of their work wind up becoming migrants and developing new homes. We're going to spend the time. Notably, we're not going to be looking at one of the most famous long-distance trade routes, the Columbian Exchange, because it did not exist yet. Remember, in the time 1200 to 1450, the two hemispheres had not yet been connected and did not yet know about one another. You can see on the left side of the codes was dominated by the actual product of silk. Silk was one of the most important products on the Silk Roads, the long distance trade routes that went from China all the way through Central Asia and reached into Europe. As a matter of fact, this painting of women making silk was a painting done on silk, just to demonstrate the importance of silk in the Silk Roads trade network. In the middle picture, you see an example or an image of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Dhows such as this were used to carry more, not only luxury items, but also bulk items because they were able to carry much higher weights. And they were able to carry them along much longer distances. On the right side, you see one of the most famous products traded on the Trans-Saharan trade. You see gold. Some of the most prominent products traded on the Trans-Saharan trade network were salt for gold. Two of the most important things somebody could have in the year 1200 to 1450. One, extraordinarily useful, and the other, a mere luxury item that demonstrated the great wealth. Let's start with the Silk Roads. You can see in this map the Silk Roads that reach all the way from the Chinese shores, all the way across South Asia into Western Europe, and even touching into the Arabian Peninsula and into Africa. The Silk Roads existed long before the year 1200. As a matter of fact, the Silk Roads trace back maybe even to about 1,000 years before the year 1200, where silk was a prominent product in high demand in places across Central Asia, but especially in, at the time, the Roman Empire. The Silk Road was able to be such an important trade route because of the security of strong governments. Most famously, in the 1200s, the Mongol Empire developed enough strength to have a large enough empire to cover almost the entirety of the Silk Roads, making it the most secure time in the history of the Silk Roads and increasing the prosperity of merchants and states involved with Silk Road trade. But there were other innovative practices that helped to develop the Silk Roads as well. One important innovative practice was the idea of the caravanserai. Caravanserai is very similar to what we think of as hotel stops. The opportunity for people to stop and spend the night and maybe take care of their animals, have a meal, maybe have some entertainment. Caravanserai were an important reality of increasing trade along the Silk Roads. Another important innovative practice happened after the year 1200 during the Tang and Song dynasties. This was the idea in the introduction of paper money, or concepts of bills of exchange, opportunity with written certificate that said this is worth so much, and people believed it because of the weight of the name that was on it, or because it was by a successful government. These innovative practices help promote growth along the Silk Roads. One of the most important realities of the Silk Roads is that trade builds cities. I know that felt a little bit dramatic, but I want it to feel dramatic because it's one of the most important realities of long distance trade. Long distance trade is dependent on the existence of cities, but also cities and even states can grow to massive amounts as a result of long distance trade. One of the ways that cities and states can become more powerful is by using the ability to tax, not only tax merchant activity, but the other economic activity that comes along when hundreds of merchants stop in one place and spend time trading their wares. There's two major examples of trade building cities along the Silk Roads. This is an example in China of a city called Kashgar. And down here we have an city just read about, Samarkand in Central Asia, result of trade on the Silk Roads. The Indian Ocean Trade Network was another very important trade network that existed in the time between 1200 and 1450. The Indian Ocean Trade Network also existed long before the year 1200, although not quite as long as the Silk Roads. The Indian Ocean Trade Network covered vast amounts of territory and was only successful because of people's ability to master monsoon winds. Monsoon winds were seasonal, often went in that went one direction for the next season. And it was merchants and maritime technicians' ability to master these winds and use them to plan out when and where they would be able to go that made trade in the Indian Ocean Network possible. Other maritime technologies that were incredibly important to the development of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. In the top left-hand corner, you see a picture of a Chinese compass. And on the right side, you see an astrolabe. Both of these were incredibly important devices when it came to navigation. The astrolabe helped use the stars in order to navigate paths and routes to get to destinations. And the compass helped make sure that the ship was traveling in the right direction. There were also a number of building technologies that led to faster and bigger ships over time in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. But one of the most important ship technology was the development of the triangular sail, known as the lateen sail, which helped make it possible for ships to move more quickly, and like previously mentioned, make it possible for them to master the monsoon winds. The Indian Ocean Trade Network also helped build new cities. One of the most important examples of this was the Swahili city-states. Swahili city-states existed in Africa on the eastern coast. You can see my laser pointer right now pointing directly at the Swahili cities. Syncretism, as many places there were developed from Eastern African tradition mixed with Arabic traditions because so many merchants came from that region. But they're also example of states that grew because of their ability to master trade and tax trade in the region. Another important is the Sultanate of Malacca. The Sultanate of Malacca was built here, and again, it was also dependent on its ability to tax the merchant activities, especially in its ability to create a navy and stop ships in the water as they were going through the Strait of Malacca here. It's important to note that this is called the Sultanate of Malacca because it is a Muslim state that was created here. And that's a really important reality for us to understand. As merchants moved to new places, oftentimes they stayed in those places for long periods of time and developed their own communities there. These minority communities of people who were far away from their homeland is often called diaspora or diasporic communities. One of the most common examples used in the Indian Ocean is the example of Muslim merchant diaspora communities. But there are also many Chinese people who left China and developed new communities in Southeast Asia. And there are other examples of diasporic communities in the Indian Ocean Trade Network as well. Finally, today, we're going to take some time to talk about the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. The Trans-Saharan Trade Network was a trade network that went across the desert of North Africa and engaged in trade just below the Sahara Desert. Or I should say just south of the Sahara Desert, not just below, because that would involve some sort of mole people. So just south of the Sahara Desert. And like the other trade networks that we've learned about today, one of the most important realities of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network was that it helped to lead to the growth of new states, and that through the growth of those new states often harnessed trade and were able to take control of trade in those regions. One of the two most common goods traded on the Trans-Saharan Trade Network were salt from gold. But also commonly traded on the Trans-Saharan Trade Network were slaves traded mostly to Islamic empires to the east. So super important transportation technologies. There were also some super important transportation technologies that made the Trans-Saharan Trade Network more suitable. One of the most significant ones was the invention of a saddle that could be used to harness the ability of camels. Camels were much more able than horses or donkeys or other kinds of animals that were used on the Silk Road. Camels were much more capable of traveling through the desert of North Africa. And so caravans, such as the one you see on the screen here, were created using the saddle of the caravans, of the saddle to harness the camels, both to help carry the luxury items that were traded along the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, and sometimes to carry the merchants themselves. Okay, so we had a very short lesson today to discuss some of the key aspects of long-distance trade routes between 1200 and 1450. If there's more that I strongly advise that you take the opportunity to go back and look at more information about these important trade networks. One of the reasons trade networks are so important in AP World History is because trade networks provide the connectivity that brings people from one region to another and helps to lead to greater interconnectedness of our world and the constant global process of globalization that brings about change and major events in world history. So take the extra time that you have today to go and maybe use Wikipedia or your textbook or the AMSCO book and learn more about these three important trade networks. All right. So I told you earlier today that we were going to continue using the DBQ, the 5-document DBQ that Mr. Laugereau gave us on Friday. Now you have a thesis. A thesis is worth 1 point. So take the time to actually take the 2 potential claims that you've made in your thesis and flesh them out using at least 4 of the 5 documents to support your claim. Tomorrow at the beginning of the lesson, Mr. Logereau is going to go over the potential responses. He's going to go over 2 potential exemplar paragraphs that will give you at least 3 more points on the AP World History 2020 DBQ. All right. Well, that's all for today, everybody. Thank you so much for stopping in and taking some time to learn with us. Please remember to take the time to learn more information about these 3 significant trade routes. And please write 2 strong paragraphs using at least 4 documents to support the claims we've already made.